For those of you who don't already know us, we are TraceSecurity. We're a cybersecurity company that was founded in 2004, and we actually just celebrated our 17th birthday last week. We are coming to you live from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I have information security analysts Evan Royer and Chris Riley here to tell you more about purple team testing. Y'all take it away.
Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for attending our webinar today. We're very excited to have you here with us today to discuss our purple team penetration test. Again, happy birthday to Trace, and a huge thanks to all the folks that made this webinar possible. As Marissa mentioned, my name is Evan Royer. I do hail from the beautiful Green Mountain state of Vermont. I'm joined by my very good friend here and work colleague, Christopher Riley, and we are extremely excited to kind of dive into this information and purple team assessment. Again, we do appreciate everyone tuning in today. So without further ado, let's review what we will be covering today. First, we'll discuss what our purple team test is, its goals, as well as the methodologies performed. Additionally, we will give an overview of the industry framework, Mitre attack, which we will use to tie the results, testing, and enhancement opportunities together. For the sake of this discussion, we will define some initial terms and definitions to clear the waters as to what our purple team test entails. So first, let's start with a penetration test. A traditional penetration test is an assessment which measures and verifies the impact of what a malicious actor or malware could potentially leverage, whether that is a security misconfiguration or vulnerability extant within applications. A red team, loosely defined, are the testers, simulators, or attackers. So these are the actors performing the penetration test, i.e. the attacking side. A blue team is the information technology and information security personnel tasked with detecting and responding to cybersecurity incidents, i.e. the defending side. And lastly, we have IOC, or indicator of compromise. An indicator of compromise is an artifact that is produced by the tools, tactics, or processes used by an adversary. This is typically an event or log entry that is ingested and reviewed by a security appliance. Some IOCs can be benign. For example, a new user in an administrative group is an indicator of compromise that is also a byproduct of a normal administrative task. So the key here is to narrow down the indicators from the noise, i.e. reducing false positives, so that the detection teams can further enhance those detective systems and reduce that noise or false positives as we spoke about. Next here, we will kind of discuss how the purple team test differs, and I'll kind of hand it over to Chris Riley here.
Awesome, thanks, Evan. So we got one more definition for you, and that is the purple team. So what is a purple team? From our previous slide, we know that the red team plays the attacking role and the blue team plays the defending role. The purple team is that perfect blend of both worlds. It's a fairly new concept in the information security world, and it consists of members from both sides, combining expertise from both ends of that spectrum. The combination allows a coordinated effort to ensure that the protective and detective technologies in place are well configured and functional. So what makes our purple team assessment different? Now that we know what it kind of is, let's talk about the test. And I think it's apt to draw a comparison to something we should all be familiar with, and that's a traditional normal penetration test. In a normal penetration test, an adversary is chosen and emulated in order to test the efficacy of the current security control implementation at dealing with the chosen threat. Broadly speaking, this process typically consists of defining a scope, performing testing, and then delivering some report. While this is broadly accurate for our purple team penetration test, the focus is just slightly different. Because our purple team test is a cooperative effort with the blue team, it requires some time commitment from your members, and that could be during the test, kind of in a back and forth, or as sort of a post-test monitoring review. In a typical test, attack paths are identified and validated, and while our purple team penetration test will do some of that as well, it's less about demonstrating the impact of the validated attack paths and is more about identifying gaps present in detection and visibility. And as a result of that, we can equip the blue team with the information required to ensure that all of the chosen tactics can be identified and reported to the blue team as necessary. Once complete, the delivered report will contain evidence demonstrating the efficacy of the detective and the preventative controls at identifying or obstructing our activities. And of course, we provide a detailed recommendation for both the mitigation issues identified, as well as to update the detective process to ensure that if we were to do the whole process again, that we'd be caught in the act. And the last point on this slide is that this is a flexible engagement. We wanted to make a point to say that no matter who's responsible for monitoring the environment, whether it's an in-house IT team or whether you have an outsourced security operations center, the assessment can ensure that all the time and the effort and the money that you spend is effective at identifying the activities and the tactics that are actually used by the bad guys.
Great, thanks, Chris. So let's kind of dive into our goals of this purple team penetration test here. So our kind of high level goals here is we want to validate, identify, and of course enhance the visibility and overall detective capabilities of your blue team, so to say. So beginning with validating these detective controls throughout the engagement, us as analysts or the red team will launch a number of attack techniques and vectors which inherently validate proper configuration and rule sets of your organization's detective capabilities. Moving into kind of identifying gaps in visibility, our process of identifying these gaps is facilitated by methodically placing ourselves in separate logical areas of your infrastructure, as well as different privilege levels. This gives us the ability to identify gaps, both large and small, in detective capabilities, appliances, and operational workflows. And so how do we utilize this information to identify enhancements to your detective controls, and how do we collaborate through this whole process to ensure that the value of this assessment does enhance those capabilities? So our collaborative effort kind of process identifies these enhancement opportunities by generating IOCs, as we previously mentioned, and then reviewing those artifacts with your blue team. So this design not only identifies the enhancement opportunities, but also identifies misconfigured solutions or other issues such as failed log forwarders, ingesters, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess, kind of what does the deliverable look like? What's the end goal of this, and what does your team receive? So what we're going to do is provide a detailed report of what was identified, prevented, and missed. So recommendations, as Chris mentioned, will be focused on visibility and improving, detective scenarios, but we will also provide any mitigating considerations in addition. So, the report will ensue, both those mitigation side as well as the detective enhancements there. I'm going to kind of hand this off to Chris. He's going to go into a little more methodology here and kind of,
So methodology. How do we propose to accomplish these goals? The first step in most security services is to define a scope. And in this vein, the first thing is to ensure that we're emulating a proper threat. If your concern is a black box on the network, that's us. If you want us to be that evil Russian agent, that's also us. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the assessment begins with defining the threat emulation. And while most people will go with that tried and true black box on the network or a compromised workstation, this can be adapted to fit whatever threat scenario that you have in mind. So now that we know who we're going to pretend to be, for lack of a better term, let's get to the nits and grits. You remember that term IOC? We will test the detective controls by generating IOCs through a combination of typical penetration testing activities and some intentional poking and prodding. We'll be generating these indicators of compromise for your detective solutions to detect, and even better, your protective solutions to prevent. Once we've performed our testing, we've run through the course of the individual indicators to hopefully trigger all these alerts. We will coordinate with your blue team to classify each one. And this process could be 100% collaborative throughout the whole, or we can do kind of an after the fact review, and we'll put them in one of 4 categories. The first category is prevented with mitigating controls. This basically means that you have stopped our activities. We were unable to complete whatever indicator we were trying to generate. And this would also typically, hopefully, mean that some sort of alert was generated from our malicious activity. The second is it's detected and alert is created, which means you've seen it and you know that it happened. So not only did the detective control identify our malicious activity, but it let you know about it. And while this isn't quite as good as preventing it outright, this is excellent as it means that your adversaries will need to try harder. The third category we have is logged without an alert created. This means that we can find the evidence, but only if we go looking for it or just so happen to stumble upon it. And while this is great from a forensics point of view, it's not so great on the detection and prevention side. The last category is not detected. And this simply means that we didn't notice it and there were no identifiable log entries created. This particular category is not necessarily an indication of negligence per se. It could simply be a result of insecure but default configurations. So let's talk a little bit more about the indicators themselves. What is all this based on? Where do we get these IOCs? How are we tying this all together? Evan, let's talk a bit about the Mitre and their attack framework.
Of course. Thanks, Chris. So kind of as we maneuver through these tests, we've kind of focused on tying this to an industry standard here, the Mitre attack framework. It's an industry standard framework with a pretty clever name, the attack framework, which is an acronym that stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. It's used to identify and map IOCs to use during both the testing and detection phases of the assessment. Let's dive a little more into Mitre here. Who is Mitre? Mitre is a not-for-profit organization that manages research for the U.S. federal agencies, such as the Department of Defense and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They also manage a common vulnerability and exposure database, which can be found at cve.mitre.org. Of course, as mentioned before, they also manage the attack framework. So why did we choose Mitre? We chose Mitre, the attack framework, as the basis for the assessment because it is an accessible industry standard framework for building an adversarial emulation through their database of tactics, techniques, and procedures. This database is created through forensic research of known advanced persistent threat actors, as well as breach response. So let's dig a little more into what these TTPs are. Let's define these. So the tactics represent the adversarial goal. What is that bad actor trying to accomplish, right? And kind of, digging a little further there, we come into techniques. So techniques are, broadly speaking, how the adversary will go about achieving said goal. So this does not refer to specific tools, but refers to a more generic method of realizing the end goal, right? And then the procedure itself is kind of how we accomplish these goals. A few of TTPs we have chosen to kind of include in our assessment kind of might help clear this up. And so we're going to illustrate a couple of these over these next few slides here and kind of illuminate these distinctions, if you will.
Perfect. So the first one that we're going to elucidate on is something I'm sure that we are all familiar with. In this first example, I, as the adversary, want to gain that initial foothold into your network. What I want is I want a beacon on one of your systems to begin my assault. So the tactic in this case is initial access. To obtain that initial access, what I've chosen to do is to create a believable message and deliver it to your employee's inbox either en masse or in some sort of very targeted attack in the hopes that this person is just not paying close enough attention that day. So the technique is called phishing. And here at TraceSecurity, we utilize the TracePhishing tool to deliver these messages to your inbox. Our next example is a little less obvious, but hopefully is just as illustrative.
So our next example we're going to kind of explain here are password sprays. This will help us, kind of clarify these TTPs, hopefully, as this is kind of a more straightforward example. A lot of people have had, hands-on experience with this. So the password spray is a method of gaining access to accounts by taking advantage of weak, default, or common passwords. The attacker uses a list of known or likely good usernames and attempts to authenticate to each of those services with a single password. So the tactic here and the goal of the password spray to gain credentialed access. So the framework the Mitre framework has categorized this as such. We have the tactic of credential access and the technique of password spray here. And kind of moving into the procedure is how do we accomplish this, right? So here at TraceSecurity, we would accomplish this TTP utilizing an open source penetration testing framework known as Metasploit. This TTP could target a variety of services, so SNMP, SSH, or SMB. Again, utilizing that Metasploit framework, we're able to, carry out these different TTPs with a variety of common tool sets and open source software. The same items that, adversaries would use. And so we make it a point to utilize those during our tests, as those are what are going to come up in real life, situations there. So I think Chris has one more for us here.
One more example for those of you who are still awake at this point. So this last one is probably the most technical of the three. In this scenario, we as the adversary have already obtained some user level Active Directory credentials, or we've accessed a user session that we can use that token to communicate with Active Directory. What we want to do is we want to see if we can easily move laterally or escalate privileges. In other words, what we want to do is we want to gain credentialed access to a separate account, but still credentialed access. So you guessed it, our tactic here is credentialed access. And in order to achieve this goal, we will set about abusing the Kerberos protocol as implemented in Microsoft's Active Directory. Any user that can request a service ticket for any user account that has a service principal name registered. So these tickets can be subjected to offline brute force attacks that can reveal the plain text of that password, therefore granting complete access to that victim account. Typically, this type of account would have elevated access to some server or some service, making this a very commonly used adversarial technique. And it's got kind of a funny name. This one is called Kerberosing. To accomplish this and generate all of the associated indicators of compromise, we use a suite of penetration tools known as Impacket. Now that we've covered a few, the overview of the assessment, its goals and methodologies at a high level, as well as the framework that we're using to tie everything together, and some examples of the TTPs that we have chosen to include in the assessment, we've anticipated a few common questions that we'd like to kind of jump the gun on a little bit. And the first one is, what level of maturity, what processes should an organization have in place before considering a purple team test? Evan, what do you think there?
Yeah, so this assessment can certainly be valuable in a number of situations. So no matter who is responsible for monitoring the environment, this assessment will validate that those detective controls are effective. So whether that's an in-house IT team or an outsourced SOC center, anything of that nature, we'll come in and run these attack techniques and vectors and still be able to identify those gaps in visibility. So we really want to focus on this. This can be utilized for a number of situations, and is not only if you have a full-scale SIEM solution. So we will work with you to identify those gaps in visibility and can give those high-level recommendations, even if you don't have a full-scale SOC solution in-house.
So I think the big takeaway there, Evan, is that no matter who's responsible for monitoring, the assessment will validate that monitoring is effective, and that all the money you're spending is not going to waste with not receiving alerts and not seeing that activity that would be malicious in the event that it happened.
That is correct. That is correct. And we work with vendors and MSPs and outsourced solutions throughout a number of our assessments. So we're very comfortable working with them, and our end goal is really identifying those gaps. And so we will help you enhance those detective capabilities, by any means possible. So, we just wanted everyone to ensure that we can open this up, and there is value in this if you don't have that full scale, in-house SIEM solution or SOC center.
So the next one we anticipated is how much time is required on the blue team's part? How does that collaboration work? What's the process by which this happens? Evan, how the test's been going?
Yeah, so the kind of the method of cooperation all depends on the amount of time your team wants to put forth. Of course, we're willing to work closely with you. Obviously, the best way is to ensure the involvement of all parties throughout the whole process. But we understand that perhaps you can't shoulder surf us throughout the entire assessment. So we could break the assessment up and give you timestamps of these TTPs, and you can go back, whether it's your third-party vendor or in-house SOC solution, to say, okay, we were able to see those, and then we can work with you either over the 3 days or on the last day, or if you would like a spreadsheet of the TTPs and timestamps, and you provide evidence kind of following that, we can still give you and identify those gaps in visibility. So the point we're trying to make here is, your involvement is completely up to you. We're willing to be with you there, throughout the whole 2 or 3 days, however we decide, how long the engagement is willing to take there. So we're very flexible. This allows us to facilitate, a back and forth that allows us to rapidly test the IOCs in conjunction, with your blue team, whether that's like in-house or, outsourced, as we've mentioned. We realize that, perhaps your security team is not able to dedicate all day or 3 days, to be with us and work through this process. So again, the point here is that we are flexible and, trying to provide that value and ensuring that, you can be as involved as you would like.
So the next one we have is what's the value over a regular penetration test? Evan, say I'm getting a regular penetration test every single year. I've got someone who's poking my external systems. I got someone who's scanning and trying to validate attack paths in my internal system. What's the benefit here over that I'm already getting?
Of course. So the kind of the value of our traditional penetration test is, we're also, detecting and identifying, the visibility gap. So in a perfect world, no one would ever get breached, no one would land on your internal infrastructure. But if that does happen, you want to be sure that you're able to identify those ongoing attacks in the early stages. That could prevent a breach, it could prevent data loss, certainly could, prevent a loss of revenue. So, by performing an assessment such as this one, it gives your team the ability to say, sleep better at night and say, hey, if for some reason some of our security controls or implementation, are not fully there, we can still see if an ongoing attack is happening in its early stages and then kind of thwart those efforts before they become dangerous and, severely impactful. So that's kind of really the benefit to that. That being said, we did want to mention that as with a traditional internal penetration test, we still will identify those mitigating findings and that mitigation. So you will be provided with those typical, impact remediation and how to fix those vulnerabilities, such as zero logon, blue keep, eternal blue. Those default configurations as you would typically receive in a normal penetration test, but the purple team test also, lets you sleep well at night by saying, okay, these are the gaps in visibility. We're able to identify those ongoing attacks kind of early on before they become impactful. So that's kind of where the value comes in with this type of test.
So I guess what we're looking at is it's not simply a list of things to fix. It's kind of a way to verify that when things are quiet and you're not getting any alerts, that the systems are working, and if needed, they would detect malicious activity.
Certainly, and that's kind of our goals and kind of why we saw a need for this, in the industry. And some of our folks said, hey, are you guys doing anything with visibility, detection? People love, all these SIEM solutions and detection capabilities are very expensive, as you know, but once they're in place, are they working? It's tough to nail down if they are, correctly configured. And, while they may be, configured for the most part correctly, us coming in and methodically, running through these different adversarial life cycles and hitting all of these techniques in those different, privilege levels and areas in your infrastructure will, of course, would definitely help me sleep better at night. So that's kind of where the value comes in over.
Yes, indeed.
Test.
I've been past a couple of more questions that came from the chat throughout the time, and we kind of build this to be rather short because we anticipated some kind of back and forth and hopefully some engagement. So keep submitting questions, y'all. We will try to answer as many as we possibly can. We've booked out the whole hour, so we've got plenty of time. The first question here I have is a penetration test required? And I guess the easiest answer to that, Evan, would probably be no. We can generate the IOCs without a penetration test per se. It would be less valuable to the team as a whole without receiving that penetration test side, but I'd imagine that just generating the IOCs, the poking and prodding, as mentioned earlier, would be something that we could offer. Well, what do you think there, Evan? Do you think that would?
Certainly. And, kind of how I read that question there is, are we going to come in and be noisy and, send all these scans all over your network? If you just wanted us to come in and say these IOCs or these TTPs, we'd like to test and ensure, that our systems are able to detect those, we certainly can do that. As we've mentioned before, this is a very flexible assessment during scoping and rules of engagement. That gives us the ability to really formulate an assessment that fits your organization and kind of covers those bases of where your concerns may be from a visibility standpoint.
Perfect. And if that wasn't the answer to your question, feel free to drop us a line and we'll open that chain of communication and we'll be sure to get you a perfect answer for you. All right, the next one here is, what type of testing benefits the most from using the purple team approach? And they offer the three common examples: the black box, the white box, or the gray box. If I had to drop an opinion, I would say the white box. If we are, as the red team, for lack of a better term, poking and prodding your infrastructure right next to you, saying, poke, do you feel that? Poke, do you feel that? That's probably the most efficacious, because as soon as we do something, we can churn through the logs, find the indicators, and say, here they are. Let's spin up a rule in Splunk or something, and let's make this happen. So it's probably the most beneficial. Black box is where we typically do penetration testing activities. So that I guess that would be the next one. Gray box is, I guess, more of a software solution penetration testing more than anything else. But hopefully that answered your question there. What do you think, Evan? White box?
Yeah,
black
certainly.
Box or gray box?
I think, white box, just the way that the assessment is kind of designed, and certainly, as I mentioned, we can be flexible and we could take a black box approach, but, us having the techniques hashed out, and as Chris mentioned, poke, did you feel that? Let's work and fix this detective rule kind of on the spot, instead of, it just being a black box test. And, if it was a black box test, you wouldn't be traditionally, you wouldn't place us logically in those different areas and privilege levels. So, for example, a recent
Less
assessment,
coverage.
certainly. So, white box would certainly be the kind of area I would lean towards there.
Perfect. So next one we got is a penetration test possible for infrastructure on a private cloud? And that's going to depend on how the routing is and how the communication flows work. If your infrastructure can communicate with that cloud infrastructure, I don't see why not. But it honestly depends on how everything is configured. Drop us a line and let's kind of talk a little bit more about that one, because infrastructure as a service, cloud providing is a little bit on the complicated side, and we would have to get a little bit more details and hash that out before we could say yay or nay on whether that would be possible, although I would err on the side of more than likely. I don't see why it wouldn't be feasible.
Sure.
The next one here is minimum time required for a test. And honestly, the more time, the better, because the more time kind of poking and prodding and taking a look at things, you find more. But that is going to depend on the size of your infrastructure and the size of your team. Obviously, if you've got a smaller network with only several hundred live nodes, it would be a much shorter test than several thousand live nodes. So we typically scale the assessment based on how many systems we'll be assessing, how many services there are online, and things like that. The additional consideration for the purple team test is how many people you have available on the blue side, how many infrastructure folks you have to assist in this process. So that would be another consideration. We tend to do penetration testing in blocks of 8, so 8, 16, 24, and most of these have been 2-day penetration test, 1 day kind of sitting down with the blue team and ensuring that everything that was tested for was either logged or identified, and if not, where can we go to find that? What can we do to ensure that for future assessments it would be? So hopefully that answered your question. Certainly. Next one. And of course,
and of course, you can always reach out to our sales team or your account manager. Of course, if you're not customers of ours, you can reach out to us and we can have those discussions. And of course, we can work with you and identify how many hours will be applicable. And of course, with more hours, we can go through more TTPs or IOCs. And of course, the more hours, the more comprehensive, I guess, is kind of what I wanted to hit on there. So those discussions with us would help kind of hash that out and probably allow us to better answer that question there.
Perfect. So the next one here is, how does this differ from the vulnerability assessments that we've performed in the past? Is this a more structured process? Was a follow-up. I guess to answer that is, there's a vast difference between a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test. A vulnerability assessment is going to be kind of reaching out to your systems and your services and seeing what's vulnerable, if there's any known CVEs or known misconfigurations with that particular service, and just kind of bringing that to your attention. A penetration test, and our penetration test specifically, come in conjunction with a vulnerability assessment. So we perform a vulnerability scan ahead of time to kind of make sure that we can see as much as possible. But then on top of that, we do manual attack path validation. So we'll look for manually identifying vulnerabilities and things that aren't easily identified with some automated tool. Currently, there's no good automated solution for doing all of that without any manual interference. So that kind of is the difference between a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test. On top of that would be the logging and monitoring review focus of this particular assessment, which then further separates it from the traditional penetration test. So I guess the answer to this is, it is worlds different from a normal vulnerability assessment. We're going to give you way more information.
Certainly, and you could think traditionally, a vulnerability assessment is let's identify the potential attack paths, where the penetration test would be let's verify those key points and those
Perfect.
vulnerabilities found extant. And then going one step further, of course, the purple team test was like, okay, let's see what the visibility looks like. Can we see these attacks that are ongoing? So if I were to separate those, that's kind of how I would describe those, if that helps a little bit.
Perfect. So the next one we have here, and we have got a lot of questions. So thanks guys for submitting all these questions. Keep them coming. We've got the rest of the hour, and we can go on if we need to. The next one is, can a purple team test replace the traditional separate internal/external pen test? And the answer is yes, totally. If you want to replace them entirely with your normal internal/external penetration testing process, they are essentially a build upon of the typical process. So the purple team penetration test performs those penetration testing activities and generates the IOCs specifically. So even if we don't identify a way to gain a foothold on a workstation, as a part of the scoping details, we would like to request access to a workstation and a user account to Active Directory in order to generate those IOCs that would be associated with that activity. So yes, it totally can, and it would be even better than the normal one, because we would be generating a whole lot more activity than we would on a normal penetration test, where we don't get a whole lot of traction. If we don't gain a foothold, there's no further exploitation possible in a pen test. But in a purple team test, typically in the scoping process, we're given that initial foothold into Active Directory, which Active Directory is the one with the biggest attack surface and by far the most to gain if you can compromise it. So that's a great question. Next one here is, can this be done remotely and/or in person? And the answer is both. We have done both, and in my opinion, in person is definitely a lot better, as most things in person are better than over the phone. But we have successfully accomplished this over Microsoft Teams and kind of screen share sessions and back and forth. It is a little bit more difficult and takes a lot more coordination, because you have all of those distractions, and there's not that person sitting across from you that can look at you and say, hey man, I'm right here, we've got to get this accomplished. So yes, I guess long and short of it is we can. Evan, you've been on site with these before. What's your input on that?
Being able to sit in a room with someone across the table, and as Chris so elegantly put it, we can poke your systems and say, hey, did you see that? We'll pull up your Steam solution on, the few I've done there has been on a projector, and it's nice to be able to go through those data points together and kind of hash that out in person. But that being said, we've certainly done them remotely and unfolded those successfully, and our clients have found a lot of value in those, even though they are remote. I typically like going on site, and so I would lean more towards that, but we can certainly accomplish them whether remote, on site. Again, we will work with you and are certainly flexible to make sure this unfolds and provides value to your organization.
Perfect. So the next one is the top 3 things we see during these assessments that organizations are not doing. And that's a hefty question. Without preparing, it's really hard to say what the top 3 things are, but I can definitely tell you what the top 1 thing is for me, and that is Kerberos logging. Many people, many organizations are not monitoring Kerberos, and that is a huge blind spot. For example, in the TTP number 3, there's a reason I chose TTP number 3, and it's because it's a very easy way to get a big win into Active Directory. If I can just rip those tickets out of Active Directory, pass them off to my Hashcat server, and get plain text really quickly, that's a super easy win almost every time. But it's really easy to detect too. If you are monitoring Kerberos, anytime someone requests, and forgive me, this is going to get into the weeds of Kerberos here, but if anyone requests an RC4 ciphered ticket from your Active Directory, that is itself an indicator of compromise. And if you're not monitoring Kerberos, if you haven't manually gone in and selected to monitor Kerberos, your Active Directory is not recording that information. So that's one. That's probably my top 1. What about you, Evan?
Certainly.
I hope I didn't just steal your thunder.
No, maybe a little bit. At times we'll see that PowerShell logging is not always turned on, and that can be because maybe you pay by the gig or the terabyte there for your SIEM solution, and if you're forwarding every single Windows log, then that can sometimes get noisy. So we've seen at times people will turn those off, and of course. As a lot of you folks probably know, there's a ton of attack surface with PowerShell. So, just ensuring that the log ingesters and the forwarders are properly enabled and turned on are kind of, some really key components there that we try to push. And, going through this test really helps us kind of fill those gaps there.
How did I forget PowerShell?
Thunder just got stolen.
All right. So the next question here is, are there any benefits to having a retest, or is everything covered in the initial test? Well, typically a retest is there to validate the remediation efforts from the infrastructure for the side, from the blue team. So if we show up and you don't see this or you don't see that, and then we do a retest and you do see this and you do see that, what we've provided is kind of a third-party independent assessor, that verification that detective control, that detective process has been properly updated to detect that indicator. So I would say, yes, there definitely is.
Certainly. And I kind of also want to mention, our playbook of TTPs and indicators of compromise are constantly growing. So if this test, aside from the retest, if you wanted us to come in next year and say, hey, we want a second purple team test, rest assured that we will work with you. And if you say, hey, we feel as though what we kind of built last year is still good to go, let's come in. And of course, the emerging threats are always changing. So our playbook is always building. So if you guys get this 2 years in a row, we will ensure that, the value is still there, and, we're not coming in and just coming through with the same tactics, techniques. So I know that doesn't specifically answer the retest question, but, I kind of felt it was a good time to, kind of plug that, right?
That kind of touches on whether or not, and this isn't a following question, but it does kind of touch on whether or not this would be kind of a one-off service. And really the answer is, during the scoping process, the tactics, techniques, and procedures associated with whatever threat you're concerned with can be altered. If you kind of on the off time kind of go pull up the Mitre attack framework on their website, you can see the quantity of the TTPs is immense. The things that they have classified in there, it's a huge database. So there's a lot to pick and choose from, and no 2 tests would have to be completely identical unless that is how you wanted it. So the next question I have here is, any appliance needed to set up in order to do the purple team testing? In terms of specific hardware or software, no, but having some sort of solution which is ingesting logs or doing some sort of log retention and management, collecting that information from various sources, is definitely beneficial. Now, kind of calling back to some previous slides, it doesn't have to be you. It could be a third party, an outsourced security operations center or something like that, where you're paying someone to achieve this goal for you. But yes, for sure, if you have that visibility, before going into this, it's definitely going to be more beneficial than not having anything set up. And the reason is the goal of the assessment is to validate and identify visibility issues. And without the software or hardware to facilitate that visibility, the value is not particularly easily added. What do you think, Evan?
Certainly, yeah. No, I think you kind of described that great there. And if you're unsure, like, hey, maybe our EDR system, our antivirus has some logs, our firewall has some logs, we can certainly still come in and do the test and say, hey, although you don't have a full, SIEM solution in place, we can give you those high-level recommendations and say, let's pull logs from these places. This is what you can see. This might be a good direction forward. Not to kind of push anyone out of the assessment. There is kind of all I wanted to add, on that point there.
All right, so that was the last of the questions that got pushed to me. So if there's any last-minute questions, we have one more slide. So we have some time. You can go ahead and push them in. We have one more slide for you, and that is our trivia. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is David Weisinger, and I have one question for you. What are the primary colors that come together to make purple?
Perfect.
In a hint, there's only two.
That
wasn't too much of a hint, was it?
I hope not. I hope not.
Marissa, do we have any last minute questions here? We can certainly keep the floor open for a couple more minutes, and you guys can always, Marissa, I don't know if you wanted us to drop either my or Chris's email in the chat, just
Looks
for
like we might have one more.
any kind of follow up.
All right, so we have, what was the term Corvus when you were talking about not being caught by the penetration test? I'm not sure. Corvus is a raven.
Oh,
right?
Man. They just throw trivia back at us?
That is reverse trivia.
Really caught off guard there.
No, I'm just
Drop us a line. I'm not sure I understand.
Something y'all brought up.
Oh, really?
I don't
Circumventing,
remember.
circumventing, if you weren't caught during the testing. Circumventing.
Are we talking about Kerberos, possibly? Like, that is a very similar word.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to either one of us, or you can contact our sales at TraceSecurity. We're there if you need any quick questions answered. Just drop us a line, and we'll do our best to elucidate anything we went over. Ensure that you guys are all aware of what exactly everything is, and we can square whatever away that you need information on.
Yeah, and we appreciate you all coming out today, and this we're very excited to perform these assessments. They're enjoyable on our part as well. It's great working with the blue side there, and being able to increase that value and make sure those detection systems are where they need to be. So as Chris said, feel free to reach out, and we would be more than happy to answer any questions.